this going. All right, fantastic. Okay, so we are diving into this new topic. We did transmission. I'm not even sure what to call it. Transmission of Torah. We last class, for anyone who wasn't at last class, I would recommend watching the replay on our website, which is jewishnovado.com/virtual. You can watch last class's replay. And we kind of went through an overview, a timeline. Really, there's a whole bunch there, but like from creation or from the giving of the Torah, and we just kind of had like a timeline to understand the concept of the written Torah and the oral Torah. A couple things I want to bring up in there because it came up last class. The difference between Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi. There's a lot, but I'm just going to give you like a short little understanding of that. Is that the Talmud Bavli was like, it was like finished, codified, I'm trying to think of what the word is, like sealed, but I'm not sure, 200 years after the Talmud Yerushalmi, which means it would be like the Talmud Bavli is the most, I'm like not having the right word, like up to date, not up to date because they're exactly up to date, but right. But it's like more like recent. That's not the right word either. Okay. I'm tripping over my words, but 200 years later was the Talmud Bavli was like finished being, like solidified, so to speak. And so it's more comprehensive. That's one difference. Another difference that I would like to bring up is, welcome to all the people that just joined. Another difference that I would like to bring up is that the Talmud Bavli has the whole back and forth. It has a lot more of all that, whereas Talmud Yerushalmi is much more straight up. So like an analogy for that would be, if let's just say there was a blind person, or you're in a dark room or something like that, and canonized. Thank you, Molly. Yes, let's go with the word canonized. The Talmud Bavli was canonized 200 years after the Talmud Yerushalmi. Now, imagine like a blind person, or you're just in a really, really, really dark room, right? And you're trying to find the exit or entry to the room. And because it's dark and you can't see anything, right? You're feeling around. And so you feel something and it ends up being the window. And then you feel something else and it ends up being the, a different locked door, and then you feel something else, right? And so you're like feeling all these other things before getting to the entry and exit, versus the Talmud, okay, versus just the ability to like, lights are on or you see everything and you're like, okay, entry, exit, right? So the Talmud Yerushalmi would be like just entry, exit, like clear in, out, right? But there's something beautiful, like you discover so much more about the room when you are like feeling around and seeing everything else. Okay. So that would be like the analogy that I want to give you, where, my personality, like I was talking about it with Rabbi Landa yesterday. So, I said to him, I'm like, what's the point of all the back and forth? Like, let's just get the bottom line. What do we have to do? He's like, yeah, if you want the bottom line, you go to Jewish law, you go to halacha, you go to the Shulchan Aruch, right? Like there's ways to get the bottom line. But there's beauty in the back and forth. It's like you exploring the room. There's the back and forth has its own beauty to it. It's not like we're doing the back and forth so we can get to the bottom line. It is Torah. It like enriches it. It gives it so much, like it's in Aramaic, it's called the shakla v'tarya, the back and forth, and it's like part of, and we're going to talk about that, the like living organism that Torah is, right? To have this like back and forth and back and forth. So that would be a difference again between the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi. Yes, and as Tessa pointed out, they were written in different places, right? One's written in Babylon during exile, and one's written in Jerusalem. Now there was an overlap; they weren't going on at the same time, but one was canonized later. Okay, so and then I think someone had brought up the question, like, well, if this is oral Torah passed down word for word, and through the generations, and how could there be all this back and forth? Like, what are we debating if this was like God told Moses, and, you know, like the oral Torah, and it was passed down and all of that. So there's different parts, there's different parts to Torah. There's different parts to Torah, and there's different parts to what happened at Mount Sinai. So there is the halacha lemoshe misinai, Jewish law given to Moses at Mount Sinai, right? The bottom line, right? And that is part of the oral Torah, and it is passed down. And then there's the part, like the legalization of Torah, so to speak. And I think we are going to get into this as much as we can throughout these classes. So right now I'm just giving you a little bit more of that fill-in. But where remember I mentioned there's 13 rules, like there's 13 rules that Torah is expounded from. So it's like very, it becomes very almost like scientific, how you can get to specific legal ruling in Torah, right? With vast Torah knowledge. So you're using these rules that are part of the oral Torah passed down, that like we, you know, like to then expound on parts of Torah that then become legalized parts of Torah later. So like, yes, there's going to be this back and forth, because the back and forth is like, well, here it says this, and if you use this rule here and here, right? So again, we have like the bottom line of what I'm trying to say before we just like dive in, and then hopefully we'll unpack this more, is that there's the parts that are just like, this was God said to Moses at Mount Sinai, here's how it's done, passed down, passed down, passed down, eventually written down, right? And then there's parts that, like even just the fact, for example, let's say there was no electricity back then, right? So nowadays, what do we do? Like what's the Shabbat rules with electricity, right? So it's not like the rabbis of today, it's not even today, but when electricity came about, it's not like they made up, well, here's how we're going to apply it to Shabbat. They used the rules and the entire way that we look at Torah and can expound from Torah and can understand how to get a halachic ruling from Torah in order to understand how to apply electricity and how we use it on Shabbat, based on those 13 rules that we can expound from Torah, and, you know, like it's like this whole legal ruling. So it's the same way that, like, if I'll call a Rav, which I meant, you know, a Rav is like a household name, right? Because, you know, my husband's a rabbi, but he's not able to give, like, I'll just give you an example. Let's just say it's a mitzvah from the Torah that we fast on Yom Kippur, right? And it's a general rule. Everyone fasts. Like it's a mitzvah for all Jewish people over the age of bar and bat mitzvah to fast on Yom Kippur. But of course, there are situations, right, where it could be unhealthy for somebody to fast, where the doctor says they can't fast, or they're on a medication that if they don't eat, it's going to hurt their stomach, right? So what do we do in those scenarios? We don't just decide, well, here's what I'm going to do because this is what I decided. In that scenario, we would call a Rav. Okay, so a Rav is somebody who's studied Torah law and Torah at a much higher and deeper level. They got ordained as a Rav. They're able to give case-specific advice to the individual. But again, they're not basing it just on whatever they feel like. They're basing it on their vast knowledge of Torah and understanding, combined with the human element in Torah that we're going to talk about, right? Combined with the fact that God wants this to be a living organism, wants this to be his wisdom and will in the hands of humans, right? So anyways, so that Rav, based on his deep knowledge and using all the different rules of how you can come to a halachic ruling, could tell that specific person, for example, like a very common thing, but again, you don't just decide it for yourself, it would come from a Rav, is that you could eat 1 ounce every 9 minutes, right, on Yom Kippur, if you are in a situation where you need to eat, right? So like that's it's called like your heter, your allowance for Yom Kippur. So how is the Rav getting to his decisions? Again, coming from his vast knowledge of Torah and how Torah is expounded upon, and how we derive any legal ruling from Torah. Okay, that was the intro. Now we are going to dive into, I'm going to share my screen. I apologize, I sent out a handout and I don't think that it worked to click on that link, and I didn't realize. So I'm anyways going to share my screen here, and we'll just bring it up right there. Okay. So the divine and the human in Torah. And this will be, yeah, a lot of different the topic for these next upcoming classes, and we're going to get this from a bunch of different angles. So does anyone remember where we stopped? Because I know we started this. So we spoke about what is Torah. We read the 13 principles of faith. We might even, does anyone know which text we're at? Okay, you know what? I don't hear anyone jumping in. So I think just for the sake of everyone who's on this, we're just going to start from the beginning of this handout.
Adina?
Okay? Yes.
We're on the second page. We finished the very first two lines on the second page on the 23rd of June, and text 3 is the first one today.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so we just discussed what is Torah, and we read the Maimonides has 13 principles of Jewish faith. We read those, and if you want that as a handout, let me know if you didn't get that. And the 8th of the 13 principles of Jewish faith is referring to the divinity of Torah. In other words, that the entire Torah is godly. Okay, which would mean it all comes from God, which would mean there's no difference between like some, very dry, quote unquote, sounding verse and like, the holiest verse that we're like, oh, hear, O Israel, the Shema, right? Which is all of that is Torah. And the written Torah as well as the oral Torah, all of it is Torah. Torah is the wisdom and will of God, and including, and then here we said in text 1, scripture, Mishnah, Talmud, Agada, anything that anyone would innovate, any later person that would innovate anything, it was already said to Moses at Sinai, okay? And then in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe kind of explains what exactly is Torah, and I'll just read that again, even though we did it last time. The Torah is the wisdom and will of God, for it arose in his will that when, for example, Reuven will argue such and such, and Shimon will argue such and such, the verdict as between them should be such and such and such. Even if this particular case never was and will never be, nevertheless, since it has arisen in the wisdom and will of the Holy One, blessed be he, that if this one argues such and the other argues such, the ruling should be such, then the person who understands and apprehends with his mind this ruling as a law that is presented in the Mishnah or the Talmud or the works of the halachic authorities, that person apprehends and grasps and encompasses within his mind the wisdom and will of God, which no thought can grasp except when they are clothed within the laws that have been presented to us. And so here what it's saying is this idea that all of it is Torah, even if we're learning a piece of Torah that will never be applicable to our lives. It's still Torah, which means it's still the wisdom and will of God. And if you want to know how to get as close to God as possible, right, it would be by learning Torah, because that is the wisdom and the will of God. So that, like, the analogy I like to give to my bat mitzvah girls, because I think they can understand it better, right? So if any of you have Pinterest or have heard of Pinterest, right, it's like this website where you can have different boards, and you can be like, here, and you pin things from the internet, like here's all my favorite foods, and here's all my favorite clothing, and or fashion stuff, and here's all my favorite hairstyles, or whatever it is, right? And you pin all your different boards. And I'm like, Torah is God's Pinterest board. This is like God saying, here are my, this is, you want to know what I love that Jewish women and girls do Friday, 18 minutes before sunset? I love when they light Shabbat candles. You want to know what I love that, like all of it, just every mitzvah and every piece of it, even the stuff that we might never, not even if it's not actual stuff we're going to do, it's like, this is the stuff I love, right? So if you want to get close to someone and you want to be, you want to deepen a relationship with someone, what is the first thing you're going to do? The first thing you're going to do is really like, I need to get to know you. I need to know what you love. I need to know how you think. I need to know how you operate. I need to know what excites you, right? It's like, I want to understand who you are. And that is what Torah is. That's God is saying, you want to understand who I am? Learn Torah. That's how you're going to see how I think and what I love and what I like, right? Okay. So text 3, Shemot Rabbah, it says, and this is from Exodus, right? He gave to Moses, when he finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of testimony. So Rabbi Abahu expounds on this verse. For the entire 40 days that Moses was above, right? He was on the mountain. He will learn Torah and forget. Said he to him, Moses to God, Master of the world, I have spent 40 days and I do not know a thing. What did God do? He gave him the Torah as a gift, as it says, he gave to Moses. Okay? So it's like there was this learning and this understanding and this trying to figure out, and really Torah is a gift to every single one of us. And to the point where every single morning in our morning blessings, we say a blessing on the Torah, okay? Blessed are you, and this is in text number 4. And we say it, it's like I say the morning blessings before I even eat, right? So it's like the blessing that I'm gonna say, usually the blessing we make before we do a mitzvah is a blessing of enjoyment, right? It's kind of like a blessing of thank you. A blessing of please. Like, please can I enjoy this apple? Or if I'm going to make a blessing on the apple before I eat it. So in the morning already, I'm going to make a blessing on the Torah for any Torah learning that I might do throughout the day. And that's in text number 4. Blessed are you, God our God, sovereign of the world, who has chosen us from all the nations and has given us his Torah. Blessed are you, God, who gives the Torah. Okay, so that's part of our morning blessings. And it's so, this blessing is so powerful, actually, that it says that one of the reasons that the Jewish people were exiled and lost, were exiled from Israel, and this is the Talmud tells us in text 5, why was the land lost? Because they did not recite the blessing which precedes the study of Torah. Okay, I mean, there's lots of reasons given, but this text shows us how powerful this blessing is. And the Rebbe expounds on this idea in text number 6. It comes from the talk of the Rebbe, that the failure to recite the blessing that acknowledges the giver of the Torah is no minor infraction of law and custom, but one that goes to the very heart of what Torah is, a divine gift rather than a human achievement. Okay, and this is really important because throughout our history, we've had plenty of groups of Jews or people, right, who have looked at Torah as this philosophy or this interesting subject to study. Let's take God out of the picture. There's nothing godly about it. And let's just look at it as, even when it's taught as a college course, right? I'm not speaking for, I don't know exactly how it's taught. I don't know what they teach there. I don't want to speak for that. But the idea, people will be oh, yeah, I took, I don't know. I have a master's in Jewish study that I got at this college. So but it's taken away from its source and its origin of what it is and what it represents. And it becomes just a subject. And that actually is what in the Hanukkah story, right, that we're all famous with. In a lot of times in our history, they wanted, the communists in Russia, right? They wanted to take away religion. They wanted Jewish people to not have anything to do with Torah and mitzvot. The Greeks in the Hanukkah story wanted it to just be a philosophy. Let's take away God out of the picture, right? They wanted it to take away the fact that this is a divine document and that this is anything spiritual. But the Greeks valued human intellectual achievement. And so they were fine with certain parts of Torah. If you look at the mitzvahs that were outlawed, it was a lot of them were the ones that were directly about connecting to a creator. Circumcision, Shabbat, right? They were okay with the Jews learning Torah as an intellectual achievement, but not as something godly. Let me just take a minute to look at the chat box. The Bible is literature. Okay, exactly, that concept. Torah is literature, right? So when people put Torah to literature, it's it's really what the Greeks wanted, honestly. Okay, the finite and mortal human mind is incapable in and of itself of apprehending the divine wisdom. Accordingly, the Rebbe would often emphasize a most important prerequisite for the study and acquisition of Torah is bittul. Now, we translate it as self-abnegation, self-nullification. There really is no good English word that I love for the word bitul or bittul, if any of you can think of one that really captures what it is. Because when we think of self-nullification or self-abnegation, I think that it has like a negative connotation, almost as if like I don't matter, like I have to not but bittul is like, it's like really giving yourself over. I mean, I don't know if any of you can think of a good word for me, but like bittul has the same letters as tevila, which means to dip. Like when we go in a mikvah, the word of going of like being completely submerged in the waters of the mikvah is tevila, which is the same letter scrambled up as bittul, because it's like you're completely giving yourself over. You're like submerging yourself and just giving over your essence to something higher than you. I don't have a good word for that. Let's see. Humility, it's much more than humility. Extreme humility, it's even more than that. Yeah. So what's interesting here is that like I'll tell you what, like I don't have a good English word for it, but humility is like, can be like I am humble, right? Bittul is like there is no I. In the moment when you're in bittul, it's like there is no I. And so what's so fast, and this is the dichotomy that we're going to go into, is that Torah has both of these in it, where there's like the divinity of it. It's not about me. It's about a creator. It's God's wisdom and will. It's right. It's something higher than me. There's like the parts that I'm going to understand and then the parts that I don't, right? Like, but then there's also so much about, of course we should try to understand, and of course we should learn, and how much like ability God gave over to humans to dissect it and to understand from it. And that's exactly what this is, the divinity and the human in Torah. And that's why it's so fascinating that you know, this idea that there is no way we can fully comprehend the divine. And so the prerequisite, like the foundation for going into Torah learning, is this idea of bittul, right? Kind of like the idea that like a very foundational concept, egoless. Yeah, that might be the closest we can get to bittul. Okay, so it's yeah, lack of ego, very, very humble, but it's kind of like this, again, self-nullification, except not in a negative sense, in a really beautiful way. I mean, yeah, okay. So this idea, for example, of kabbalat ol, which would be, again, it's translated as like accepting the yoke, but what it is again, just like that, you know, when I'm teaching a 2-year-old to say the modani and wash their hands 6 times, you know, in the morning, and they're too little to understand this concept of tuma, the impurity that rests on our fingertips when we sleep, because our soul leaves us through the fingertips, you know, like that whole concept. A 2-year-old's not going to understand that. So when if they would say, why do we, you know, if a little kid, whatever, my 4-year-old, my chaya, is like, why do we wash nagavas, or why are we washing? And I could say, because Hashem wants us to, right? Like, it's a simple answer. That's like kabbalat ol, and that's a foundation of, for children, is number one is kabbalat ol. And then of course, as they get older, we unpack it more, we understand it more. And as we get older and older, it's on a deeper level and deeper level and deeper level, right? Till here we are in Torah and T, and of course we want to unpack it. But the foundation of our service is kabbalat ol. It's kind of like the same idea, even just if you could understand it, like to a parent to a child, right? So like, I can, you know, if I ask my kid to clean their room and they ask me, why should I, right? I could answer, I could say, because I don't know, I like clean rooms and I want you to learn responsibility and I want you to also appreciate your clean room. Or I could just, because your mother said so. And there is a beautiful element in the idea of because I said so, right? Like that is the foundation. Like, yes, later I might want to explain and later, but there is a because I said so, and you care to have a relationship with me, and therefore, right? Especially because sometimes it, you know, a clean room we could try to explain. Sometimes there isn't an explanation that I can say that will make your child happy, that will make them be like, oh, now I get it. They might just not, you know, they might just not like it, and it's okay. Reason enough is because your mother said so, right? So that would be like this idea here, where if going into understanding Torah and learning Torah with bittul and kabbalat ol as a foundation, and then of course we want to understand it, we want to unpack it, we want it to be truly meaningful to us, all of that. Rita asked, wasn't Moses most humble? Yes, absolutely. And the word there, though, for Moses being humble is anav, anava. So v'ha'ish Moshe anav mikol ha'adam. Moses was the most humble from all people, right? So it's just a different word here than bittul. Complete acceptance, surrender. There you go. You guys can put all those together, and then you get the concept of bittul. Okay. So let's keep going. Okay. Text number 7. Does somebody else want to read? Text number 7. When I'm sharing my screen, it's harder for me to see each of you. So somebody could just unmute themselves and pop in.
This is Gail.
Gail,
I'll do
it.
it. Why are the words of Torah compared to water? To tell you that just as water forsakes a high place and travels to a low place, so do the words of Torah endure in one who is of a humble mind. An empty vessel can retain that which is poured into it. A full vessel cannot retain. The study of Torah requires its student to engage the faculty that is the crowning glory of the human being, the intellect. Yet an equally crucial requirement is that the person empty himself of the arrogance and pretension that a human mind, even the most astute and accomplished of human minds, is capable of apprehending the infinite and superrational mind of God. The knowledge and understanding of Torah is a divine gift bestowed on those who approach its study with the humility and the commitment to conceive, understand, listen, learn, teach, keep, and do that which God desires of us.
Thank you. Okay, so again, this idea of, on the one hand, using our own knowledge and understanding, and on the other hand, using our humility and our commitment, right? It's really a beautiful combination, I think, of what goes into Torah study. Okay.
Adina?
Yes.
There's also that Torah is compared to water.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we read the Torah every 3 days, because I think, what is that? That's as long as you can go without drinking water.
Yeah,
so
I
we
love
have
that.
to have Torah. So what is it? Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos when we read Torah.
Yes. Yeah.
I love that. It's so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have any questions so far, or anything that they want to bring up? Or we're good to keep going? Okay.
Okay. One thing in another class was that water is essential for human beings.
Mm-hmm.
We can't live without it.
Yeah.
And water is like there's a book I learned in graduate school, and it's a fitness of the environment, that without water, our earth would not be the same. And that's because the way that this is very kind of scientific, but the fact that when it freezes, it floats. It's most unusual, because if it didn't do that, and actually like any other material, and sank when it got frozen, we would wipe out everything that's living in any pond or ocean or body of water. So it's like water is what we need for life, and that chemical balance, the chemical compound of water, it's a unique, and that's why when they're trying to find life on other planets, they need to find water, because that would sustain life.
Mm. Thank you.
Adina?
Yeah.
I have a question on that last sentence. Those who approach study with the humility and commitment to do all those things.
Yeah.
What about the concept of Torah just for the sake of study? I forgot the word in Hebrew. Lishmat, do you know what I mean?
Like Torah study in and of its own is a mitzvah. One of the 613 mitzvahs, just to learn Torah. Oh, so you're saying why is it saying in order to do?
Yeah, why all those things?
I think it's also a little bit of a paradox, because on the one hand, learning Torah on its own has a huge merit, right? Because you're learning God's wisdom and will. It's one of the 613 mitzvot. On the other hand, isn't the point of learning Torah in order to know what to do, how to live our lives, right? So,
It's Torah Lishmat. That's what I was thinking of.
right. Learning Torah just for its own sake, even if it
Yeah.
leads to nothing, right?
Isn't there a Kabbalistic explanation for that but I forget what it is, but I think there is one
Saying what's in
of why it has merit for its own sake.
I mean, it has merit for its own
It
sake
draws,
because
it
it's
draws something about it draws you up to a higher world.
mhm.
I don't remember the whole thing. It's
So
in
there's like
Tanya.
this whole, like in Tanya, when the Alter Rebbe
Yeah.
he talks chapters and chapters about how just Torah study is the most amazing thing that you could do, the most amazing thing you could do,
Right.
like how special it is. And then chapters and chapters about a mitzvah is the most amazing thing you could do, and right? And it's like, well, which one is it? You know? And I think the beauty is that there is so much paradox in it. And I think that both are supremely important. There are different groups of Jews that will put emphasis. I don't know if it's emphasis, there are people that will sit in groups of Jews that sit in kollel all day. Like that's, that's what they aspire to do is learn Torah all day long. And truly it's a beautiful thing. It's not Chabad's way, right? Our way is not like we do it the first year of marriage, maybe the first 2 years of marriage, where the husband will sit and learn that as his like occupation. But then it's about going out into the world and refining the world and being much more involved in the world, and much more about what are you going to do with your Torah study, right? And it's, again, I'm not saying that those people that are sitting and learning Torah, they're also observing it. It's not like it's not like they're studying just to study as an intellectual pursuit, but it's like, we're going to go bring Torah out into the world. We're going to go like warm up the world with the study of Torah instead of just, so it's kind of like a matter of perspective. The parable, I guess, that we would use to explain the Chabad philosophy might be, if someone's in a room and it's really, really, really cold, right? You can go put on a fur coat, like the way they're, a chassid pelts, which means a chassid in a fur coat. You can go put on a fur coat to warm yourself up, or you can go light a fire and warm up everyone in the room, right? So the way we see the concept of like sitting and learning Torah all day is like, it's a beautiful thing. But what you're doing is like, what are my own advancements? Where can I get in my own spiritual standing or my own connection with God, versus like, I'm going to go light up the room, right? I'm going to, even if that comes at a cost to my own personal achievement, I'm still going to do that for the sake of everyone else around me. So that's, but again, it's a philosophy, and I don't think it's about right or wrong. It's just, there's different, viewpoints about it. But what really, resonates is this idea that Torah study on its own has its own merit. It's its own mitzvah. It's a beautiful thing. And we also want to practice Torah, right? I mean, it says in Pirkei Avot that Torah study that doesn't lead to you doing something with it, right, is like, it's as if you didn't study. Like, in other words, if you're going to learn, you can learn from today to tomorrow about, like, you can learn for days and days about all the intricacies of giving charity and all the different aspects, and in this way and in that way, and what's the highest form of charity and the lowest form of charity, and does it count if you give your time, and if you give your energy, if you give someone a job, and all of this stuff. You can learn it, and it is learning God's will. And then you go and do nothing. You give zero charity, right? Like, is there a value into learning it?
Did you learn it if that's what you did?
What? Say it again?
Did you really learn it if you didn't give charity?
You learned it, right? But yeah, like, that's the question. Like,
Well, it's theory versus practice.
right. I actually just heard, I think it might be like a Chinese proverb that I just literally heard today, right? But if you know what to do and you don't do it, then you don't know what to do.
Exactly.
Something like that. So it's like,
Well, what you could do is you could put on your coat and light the fire, and then you get warm a lot faster. So there's room for both.
right. So that's what I'm saying. It's, in a way, it's a paradox, because did that
Yeah.
person still learn Torah? Yeah, they did. Right. And again, especially because we always want to come from the positive twist, right? Maybe my more primitive self or whatever, my lower self would want to look at them and say, oh, you learn all this Torah, you just learned for 5 days about the concept of charity and you give none of it, But for sure, like Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, who was just like known as a chassid that always put a twist on everything, right? But he would absolutely look at this person and say, like, how incredible that at least he learned, you know, like, I usually had good phrases, right? Like there was one time, I think there was like a Jew who was wearing his, you know, still his prayer shawl, his talit and his tefillin. He was in the middle of prayer and he went out and started fixing his wagon and was like fixing the wheel. He was underneath getting greasy and dirty. And, you know, other people were saying that, how could you do that? How you're in your talit, you're in your tefillin, at least take it off. And like, you know, how, whatever. And Reb Levi Yitzchak was like, God, look how amazing like your Jewish people are. They're in the middle of fixing their wagon and they wear their talit and their tefillin, right? Like the switch of it, not like he's in the middle of prayer and he goes to fix things. He's like in the middle of fixing things and he cares to connect with you. So like really, right? We could look at such a person who would just learn all the concepts and we could just look at that with a beautiful eye, right? Which could be they're learning, right? And there is a quote, phrase, I think it's from the Talmud, mitoch shelo lishma. Tessa was talking about Torah lishma, which means Torah just for its own sake of learning. Mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. Even if it comes from something that's, you know, has an ulterior motive, it's not for its own sake, it will come to learning for its own sake. So for example, let's just say there's someone who's like, I'm going to learn because then everyone's going to think I'm brilliant and I'm smart and I'm a scholar. And that's why they're learning, right? That would be lo lishma. They're not learning for the sake of this is God's wisdom and will I'm learning. They're learning because they want everyone to think grand of them. But according to this phrase, okay, let them learn for that reason. Mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. It'll come from an ulterior motive, but it will come to doing something for its own sake, right? So again, not here to judge what anyone is choosing to do or not choosing to do or whatever, but I think that there is this paradox to Torah study on its own being a beautiful, wonderful thing, and Torah study also is meant to learn what we're supposed to do, right? It's an owner's manual for life. It's telling us, you know, God didn't just put us in a soul into a body, throw us down into this world and say, figure things out. God said, I'm giving you a soul, I'm giving you a body, and I'm giving you exactly the pathway for everything, how to have healthy relationships, how to parenting, you know, how to connect to me, how to fulfill your purpose. It's all in there, right? So it is about doing. Okay, so that is the godly part here. But then what's so fascinating is the way, and we're going to see from these texts, the human element, right? This where on the one hand, there's the wisdom and will of God, but then we have this whole other way of looking at Torah. So text number 8, this is from Deuteronomy. Does anyone want to just feel free to unmute yourself and read text number 8?
I can read.
Okay, go for it.
For this commandment which I command you this day, it's not hidden from you. Neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who shall go up for us to heaven and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who shall cross the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Rather, the thing that is very near to you in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. In addition to being a statement on the accessibility of Torah to each and every individual, this is also understood to mean that the process of understanding, interpreting, and applying the laws and principles of Torah is a rational, logical one, entrusted wholly and exclusively to the rational processes of the human mind. The Talmud illustrates this principle with the following account of a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the other sages on a point of Torah law. The debate concerned whether a certain type of oven is susceptible to ritual impurity or not. On that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought them all sorts of proofs, but they did not accept them. Said he to them, if the law is as I say, let this carob tree prove it. Thereupon the carob tree was uprooted 100 cubits out of its place. Others say 400 cubits. Said they to him, one cannot bring proof from a carob tree. Responded he to them, if the law is as I say, let the water channel prove it. The water channel began to flow in reverse. Said they to him, one cannot bring proof from a water channel. Responded he to them, if the law is as I say, let the walls of the study hall prove it. The walls of the study hall inclined to fall. Rabbi Joshua scolded them, saying to them, "If Torah scholars are combating one another in a matter of Torah law, what have you to interfere?" The walls did not fall in deference to Rabbi Joshua, nor did they straighten in deference to Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still standing thus inclined. Again he said to them, "If the law is as I say, may it be proven from heaven." There then issued a heavenly voice which proclaimed, "What do you want of Rabbi Eliezer? The law is as he says." Rabbi Joshua stood on his feet and said, "It's not in heaven." "What is the meaning of the statement, 'it is not in heaven'?" said Rabbi Yirmiyah. "We take no notice of heavenly voices, since God, you have already at Sinai written in the Torah to follow the majority opinion." Rabbi Nathan subsequently met Elijah the prophet and asked him, "What did God do at that moment?" Elijah replied, "He smiled and said, 'My children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me.'" After the divine communication of the Torah and the methodologies of Torah exegesis, how do you say that?
Expounding upon.
Exegesis
Yeah.
through Moses, the interpretation and application of Torah is entrusted exclusively to the Torah sages of each generation, who employ the tools of rational deduction to reveal the divine wisdom and will implicit in the Torah. It is the inherently finite and fallible human intellect, rather than divine revelation, that is the vehicle by which Torah is expounded and applied.
Thank you. Okay, so some fascinating stuff in there, right? Where we kind of go from this one part one, where we're talking about the divinity of Torah, into this idea where God, so to speak, handed it over. And again, I use that carefully, right? into human hands of understanding, right, how it applies. Like, fascinatingly, that story, right, which is a very famous story in the Talmud, of this oven, and they were debating over it, right? And Rabbi Eliezer was saying, "It's as I say, as I say, as I say." But really, if there's another concept of that the Torah ruling goes according to the majority, and the majority opinion was saying the other way. In other words, even if, so to speak, Rabbi Eliezer was right, that he had the halachic ruling that was right. We saw there was even a heavenly voice that said, "It's as Rabbi Eliezer says," and then Joshua said, "Well, it doesn't matter a heavenly voice, because Torah is down here now, and there's the majority of people that hold it on this opinion, and that God was saying, 'My children have triumphed over me with joy.'" In other words, yes, they have made this definitive understanding of this halachic ruling. Okay, so again, this is I think it's a challenging concept, because we're holding these two paradoxes in our hands, right? Where on the one hand, Torah is 100% divine, and we need to approach it with, again, that bittul and that kabbalat ol, right, which would be that like extreme humility and egolessness and understanding that this is godly. And on the other hand, like, where does the human part take a plane here, right? So for example, I gave you that example of, if someone's fasting on, about Yom Kippur, and they go to a Rav, right? Now, the idea of going to a Rav and getting a case-specific scenario is also so that I know that what the Rav says is what God wants me to do in that moment. Because right? Because it's like, well, I'm supposed to fast on Yom Kippur, and the doctor's telling me I can't. So but I need to take care of my health, so I have to listen to the doctor or listen to, right? Versus so here it would be like, what the Rav tells me is what God wants me to do. It's not like, well, God wants you to fast, but because your doctor says no, I'm giving you permission not to fast. It's like God, it's again, like kind of like that paradox, right? So where was I going with this? So it's like, what the Rav is saying is the divine, the divine ruling of that thing at that time, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Well, it's like somebody has authorization to speak for you.
Someone has
Right?
authorization to speak.
Like, say you're somebody's guardian.
Yeah.
So then you're authorized to speak for them. So I think it's similar to that, not really a paradox, but just that the other person has authorization.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like God saying, like, yes, this is my wisdom, my will, my Torah, my, right? But I'm also giving it over, right? Especially because here's the thing also is like the language. I was talking about this with Menachem, with Rabbi Landa last night when we were talking about the Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi. And I said, he said, if Moses would have written it down, then like language has changed and we wouldn't even understand necessarily what Moses is talking about if he wrote down the oral Torah then. But then I said like, well, okay, but it was written down centuries later, but things have changed then too, right? But that's like the fascinating part is that it's like Torah is a living organism. It is dynamic. It is and it isn't. Right?
Adina.
There's this stuff. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. Sorry,
Okay.
I was going to ask you a question, but
go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, is it not the reason why the rabbi was celebrating and so happy and saying, or Elijah was saying, my children have triumphed over me, is because the whole point of Judaism and Torah is to discuss and to learn and so that everyone gets involved so new generations and people were getting together to really delve into it and really discuss it to the point that there is a debate and there is a majority over a minority, then it's almost like allowing the Torah to evolve within the realms of the law. Like they're not changing it, but it's different opinions, and within having different opinions it means that you're really thinking about it and therefore learning more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, 100%. And that's like the beauty. Like Torah is meant to be like that. And which is why we have so much back and forth in the Gemara, that even if it's like, well, we know the bottom line, why would I learn all the back and forth? Is because the back and forth is Torah. It is part of the beauty, 100%. Yes. Okay. Naomi just asked, you explain the idea of because God says so with an expression that sounded like Kabbalat Ol. Kabbalat Ol translates as accepting the yoke, but what it means is like, it's kind of like I'm going to do whether I understand it or not. Like when God came to the Jewish people and said, do you want my Torah? Their answer was, Nasa Benishma. We're going to do it, and then we're going to understand it, and then we're going to learn it, right? So that's like Kabbalat Ol. It's like, it's not like all the other nations that were like, well, what's in it? Let me see if I like it. Let me see if it makes sense to me. Let me see if it jives with my way of life. You know, like all of that. They were like, the Jewish people said, well, we're doing it, and then we're going to go learn it, which is exactly how we do it. Look, we're all learning it right now.
Adina, it's accepting the yoke of heaven. It's like you're accepting to accept Torah and try to do it to the best of your ability. It's a tremendous responsibility when you think about it. And it's like maybe, I don't know, like when you think of a yoke, I think of oxen being,
I know, that's why I find it a funny translation.
It's an odd word, but when you think about it, in a way, Torah is keeping all of us together.
Right.
In the positive sense.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And as for the bat kol, it's the voice from heaven, and God intervenes with the oven of Achnai, but was it Joshua who says, no, it's not in heaven anymore. You gave it to us. Yes. So now we have to decide what to do with it.
Right.
So it's a wonderful tension between heaven and earth.
Yes.
It's marvelous. And I always like a tension. I always liken it. It's like keeps us on an even path. It's a leveler. It's a straight line. You can't have tension unless it's pulled tight. And by pulling it tight, it's easier to walk on it. At least that's my interpretation.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
That's beautiful, Tessa. Thank you so much. That was really lovely.
Yeah. Got lots of insights from you today, Tessa. You want to teach next week's class for me?
No, thank you, dear. No, thank you. But I appreciate the offer.
Okay. All right, so now so exactly this tension that Tessa's referring to is where we're going to get to next, where we talk about this phenomenon of machloket. Machloket means argument. You know, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. As Jews, we love it. We love machloket. And so we're going to talk about that and see how we see that in the Torah. Okay. So it's a machloket is referred to as like a dispute among the sages, dispute about Torah law. We find it all across Torah, with differing opinions, differing conclusions, all of that. And the Talmud tells us in Hebrew, it's elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. These and these are both the words of the living God, right? Which again is what I love, because we as humans, I think we like to be very black and white. And what's fascinating actually is that Torah is not very black and white. There is so much room for not black and whiteness. Interestingly, right? Like, yes, there is black and white, and there is also so much gray. And so it's like the Talmud tells us these and these are the words of the living God. Okay. Hold on,
Adina, it's
Yes.
Tessa. I have to interrupt again. I'm sorry.
Please do.
Torah is black and white, though. It's the written. But we need the oral to show us the shades of gray. Because if you just read, he was, an eye for an eye, and all of those, things, what that means, somebody could read that and think, oh my God, they take out somebody's eye. But
Right.
then you have the oral law, which explains, no, it's talking about compensation.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, the Torah is black and white, but it's the commentaries, Talmud and Gemara and all that, Mishnah and Gemara, that fill in the blanks, so to speak.
Yeah.
The interpretation.
So again, I think 100. Yes, I think it's both. There's a lot of black and white, because black and white is just there's right and wrong, right? What we know right and wrong from Torah.
Right.
But then there's also, like, let's just say, for example, the mitzvah of Jewish modesty, right? There's some black and white within what that mitzvah entails. And then there's so much room for our own personal sensitivities to what is considered modest or immodest. There's so much room for, one person doing, like, expressing their Jewish modesty in one way and another person doing it in another way. And a lot of mitzvot, there are like that, right? So there's the black and white of Shabbat.
Yeah.
And then there's the spirit of Shabbat. And within there, right, like in one household, maybe they're not gonna, play basketball even in their backyard. You're not carrying the ball, whatever, right? Because maybe it's not in the spirit of Shabbat. It feels like a very weekday sporty activity. And in another household, they're like, no, we do play sport, right? So and I think so many mitzvot, even, like, I guess that's what I mean. And I think that brings the beauty of it. There's kosher, there's fakin, right? Fake bacon, kosher, or there's so many like of these, fake things. So that are kosher products. I actually just saw this like bag of like pig rinds. Pig rinds, they're kosher because they're fake.
Yeah, but that's Morit Ayin. It doesn't look right.
Okay. So my father, like, I remember, because my uncle loves to have, like, they're called like bacon bits that he would pour in his salad, like little toppings on his salad, and they had a OU on them. My father was like, no, we're not having bacon bits, right? But like, you're right. It could be Marat Ayin, so maybe it depends, like, how you're doing it, where, publicly, whatever. Maybe in your own household, it's not Marat Ayin because it's literally like the people right there. I don't know, So again, there's like a sensitivity there that some people might have, some people might not. And the person that doesn't have that sensitivity isn't doing anything. They're still keeping kosher because it is a kosher product, right? So yeah. I guess my point is, like, all those things where it's like, this is our custom. This is how our household does it. This is, what we do to celebrate Shabbat with the spirit of Shabbat. Like those things, there's the black and white of Torah, and then there's like this whole gray spectrum. And I think there might even be more of the gray spectrum than the black and white. And
but I'm saying, Adina, that I think when somebody like myself, when I was starting my Jewish studies, if I just read the Torah, I didn't know there was gray.
Right.
So I think you need the other sources to teach the gray to you.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
Because
it
you,
works in reverse too. Sometimes the Torah is gray, and then the Talmud is a lot clearer and more definite. Like, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. What does that even mean, to keep something holy? That's, sort of gray.
That's interesting, right? So it's like you're kind of
Right.
looking at it. So Tessa, you're saying Torah is black and white, but we need the explanation in the oral Torah to explain the gray.
yes.
And Adrian's saying the opposite, right? If I just read Torah, it's very confusing. It's
Yes.
gray. I don't get it.
Yeah.
And then the rest of it explains like the black and white.
And if you're talking about what something looks like, that in itself is subjective, because you're talking about what something looks like. It could look like 20 different things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great also.
Food for thought.
Yeah. Okay, I'm done.
All right.
I've got enough for today.
Okay. So wait, so we did that. These are words of the living God. Okay, text 11 from the Jerusalem Talmud. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and read that?
I can do that.
Okay.
Rav Yanai said, if the Torah would have been given, cut and dried, we would not have a foot on which to stand. What is the meaning of this? God spoke to Moses. Said Moses before him, Master of the world, tell me how the law should be. Said God to him, follow the majority. If the majority says he is innocent, they have made him innocent. If the majority says he is guilty, they have made him guilty. Thus the Torah is expounded in 49 ways that deem an object impure, and 49 ways that deem it pure. Similarly, the Talmudic sage Rav Elazar ben Azariah declares, Torah scholars sit in numerous groups and study the Torah. One group deems a thing impure and another deems it pure. One group forbids a deed and another permits it. One group disqualifies something and another renders it fit. Should a person then ask, how then might I study Torah? Therefore we are taught, always received from a single pastor. One provider said them from the mouth of the master of all works. As it is written, God spoke all these words. So make your ears as a hopper and acquire a perceptive heart to understand the words of those who deem impure and the words of those who deem pure, the words of those who forbid and the words of those who permit, the words of those who disqualify and the words of those who render it fit.
Thank you. Okay. All right, text 12.
Adina,
Yes.
I just wanted to add that I absolutely love that, because it's talking about what was the word again before that was egoless?
Bittul.
Yeah, it requires bittul because human beings so want to be right.
Yeah.
And their ego wants them to understand everything and prove everything and know that they're right and others are wrong, not from a bad way, but just because we're human and we try and understand things. And because the Torah and this anything so godly is so beyond our human capability and understanding, as a simple like black and white or gray. It's just so I love the fact that it's like, yeah, this is, see all sides and take all of it, all the words, like the contradictions and the back and forth, and just be open to all of it.
Mm-hmm.
and just and see. And for me it's just like, can I be with that? Like, that's so hard for me to be with because I want to be right.
Yeah.
And even when I hear discussions, I'm like, no, that's not, this is the way it is.
Right.
But it's so, it opens you up. It opens if you're willing to be open and have a willingness to learn and really understand that we're all one, we're all part of one, then it does make sense that there is so many different sides and so many different everyone has a say, and yet with law there does have to be, you do have to draw the line, so that, if the majority says something, then that's the way we go, because that's how we have to live. But there's just something really beautiful about that last part that was just like, embrace all of it and don't be so high on your horse to think that the answer.
It takes
You know?
humility, right? It takes that bitzel
Absolutely.
to be like,
Yeah.
oh, let me hear something that doesn't really jive with my brain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I took something else from that, or maybe it's in addition to what was just said, which is that God wants us to have an understanding of various viewpoints, but always in light of the fact that those are God's spoken words. So we're understanding how different people look at God's spoken words. It's not just going off on a tangent that doesn't understand the divine, or maybe not understands the wrong word, but does not encompass the divine.
Right.
I love that.
100%. Right? Like, it doesn't mean that anyone could just derive whatever they want from Torah. We've had false messiahs in our history. Oh my gosh, his name just totally escaped me. What's the Shabtai Tzvi, right? So Shabtai Tzvi was this false messiah, and he started, like, how do we know that he was false? Is he started like deviating from Torah. He started explaining how now we could eat pig, and now we could do the, like all these different things. And then it was like, hold on a second, you can't, right? Like, then you're not legitimate anymore if you're gonna, like, so it's not just, anyone could derive anything from Torah and then that's legitimate, and let's look at all the different sides and how they do it, right? There is, like, again, that paradox. There is the, like, unchanging Torah's Moshe Sinai, godly wisdom, and it's from the words of Torah. And then there's, like, again, all the machloket and the different opinions and stuff like that.
Interpretations.
So,
yeah.
So is there a real bottom line? We listen to everything, and then is the bottom line somewhere in there so that we know how to actually do what we're supposed to do?
Is there a bottom line?
I found it confusing because it sounded like saying, well, yes, this one is right and this one is right too, and so is this one. So how do we decide how, who to follow for how we live?
Do you have, like, a specific scenario? Because, like, there is a bottom line. Yeah, we have Jewish law. Jewish law is a bottom line. If we're unsure about how Jewish law would apply in a certain scenario, we could always ask a Rav, or if it needs a Rav, sometimes it's just someone who's very knowledgeable in all the back and forth. So do you have, like, a specific scenario that you're like, I don't know the bottom line to this?
I was listening to that text being read, and I found it maybe like the first person who responded and said, like, it sounds like we should be open to all opinions and not get into, well, what's the right way. Of course, we do have to get into what's the right way because we want to follow halakha into what God tells us to do. So right. It was a little hard to wrap my brain around.
Yeah, kind of like if you learn Talmud Bavli, you're going to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and there's beauty in that back and forth. If you're like, what's the bottom line halacha? What's the bottom line Jewish law? I could go straight to Jewish law. I could skip all the back and forth. That's my tendency. But, like, sometimes I'm like, it's hard for me to understand why you want to spend 2 hours learning back and forths. I'm like, I just want to know what the bottom line is, right? But I admire the quality of people that are, just want to hear back and forth and back and forth.
I wonder if it's a male-female thing that, because men, my understanding is that men are encouraged and they like to study Talmud more than women do.
Yes or no? I don't know. Ria, didn't you just go through you went through the whole Talmud?
We're doing it, yeah. That's true.
How was that experience for you, Ria?
It's been great because I'm doing it with my husband.
Yeah. Do you love all the back and forth?
I would probably say that I understand probably less than a third of what we read and study.
Okay.
But the process is so interesting. And
yeah.
In fact, we have this 2,000-year-old recording of conversations is just amazing to me.
Yeah. So you're not the type that's like, well, what's the resolution here? You're like, oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, often there isn't a resolution. You
right.
go through pages to pages, and then it says, this issue is not resolved.
Yeah.
I love both. I actually love both. I love listening to learned people talk about like having a discussion, and everyone is heard, everyone is able to be involved, and can question things and ask and listen to everyone else's opinion, and I think that's so rich. But I also do love to know in the back of my mind that there is a law there, and there is a bottom line. But I think that the richness and the learning is so interesting because it's another way of learning. It's not just reading it and memorizing it. It's by the involvement and the community and the discussion or the verbringen, whatever it is that comes about, that brings people together to discuss things that ultimately everyone's very passionate about. It's just a real, I think there's a lot of gifts that come from these conversations.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
But I do love the bottom line as well.
It does make it very rich. All right, text 12. This is from Deuteronomy. God commanded us to heed the sages of the generation. As he said, if there arise a matter that is beyond you to judge, you shall come to the judge who shall be in those days. So it is along these lines that halachic disputes arise, not because they erred concerning the laws handed down from Sinai, or because one is saying the truth and the other is saying a falsehood. Okay, so in text number 13, and this is from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, which is in the Mishnah, any dispute that is for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. One that is not for the sake of heaven is not destined to endure. Which is a dispute that is for the sake of heaven? The dispute between Hillel and Shammai. Which is a dispute that is not for the sake of heaven? The dispute of Korach and all his company, right? Which we just learned that story, right? So Hillel and Shammai, yes, it's very famous that they disagreed and they had different philosophies, but it was a disagreement of love, right? It was a dispute for the sake of heaven. They weren't enemies. They had different approaches to things, and it was ultimately for the sake of heaven. Like, what does God want from us? Versus Korach, that it was more of rebellion than for the sake of heaven. Although Tessa could probably enlighten us more there with all the classes that you took. Okay. So question, why would it be desirable for any dispute, albeit one that is for the sake of heaven, to endure? Should not the objective be to resolve the dispute and discover which is the correct opinion, right? This is like what we're talking about here, this concept of machloket. In the case of the Torah machloket, these and these are both the words of the living God. Both opinions are the product of the human mind applying the divinely given principles of Torah exegesis to the divinely given words of the written Torah, which incorporate within them 49 ways of deeming an object impure and 49 ways of deeming it pure, right? So in other words, and there's also this idea of 13 principles with which the Torah is expounded upon. Like there's rules, there's like, it's like, I think before it was saying that, I don't know if it used the word scientific, but that like it could be scientific. Like let's say for Shabbat, I think, I've said this before, so this might feel a little redundant to everyone, but the biggest misconception is that we don't work on Shabbat. And I always say that's not true because it's a lot less work to flip up a light switch, right, than it is to walk 2.3 miles to Shul, right? Or it's a lot less work to flip up a light switch than it is to serve 20 guests at your Shabbat table, right? So it has nothing to do with work. It has to do with creative activity. Right? So God created the world in 6 days and stopped creating on the seventh, and God asked us to stop our own creative activity, that it's 6 days of the week we want to engage in refining the world and elevating the world and working the world and putting ourselves into the world. And on the seventh day, we step back and we observe the world and we do not create. Now, how do we know what is considered creative activity? It's a very scientific, actually, right? It's like there are 39 categories of creative activity. How do we know what the 39 categories are? They're the 39 categories of creative activity that the Jews used to build the Holy Temple, right? So for example, dyeing material, right, for the curtains of the temple, right? So they would dye material. So dyeing and changing the color of something is a creative activity, right? So it's like it gets very scientific because there's 39 categories, and then which things fall under those 39 categories, and then there's all these like derivatives, right? So for example, combustion, like creating a fire, that's one of them. Or sorry, creating a fire. You can't create a fire, okay? So then what's the derivative of creating? So we don't create fires because that's creative activity. But then what's all the derivatives is that would be any combustion, which would be flipping a light switch or the key in the ignition, or right? Like there's so many, all forms of electricity essentially are combustion, which is starts with a spark, creating a fire. So it's actually very, very, very scientific how we get to the laws of Shabbat, of the do's and the don'ts, based on exactly all the rules, all the principles of how you derive things from Torah. So why did I bring that up? Right, that there's, right, these are the words of the living God, the idea of the human mind applying divinely given principles using principles, right? So both are Torah, even if only one of them is selected, using these self-same principles as the one that is followed in actuality. The dispute endures as both opinions guide our lives, whether as practical instruction or as spiritual insight. And that's like the beauty here. It's like, yes, there might be a dispute, and one opinion is the one that we actually follow and do, but the other one is valid as spiritual insight. Furthermore, as we shall see in Torah, the opposing views of a machloket inform and reinforce one another, so that the dispute itself expresses a deeper truth, which underlies and incorporates them both and adds depth and meaning to each. Machloket may be a feature of the limitations and deficiencies of human mind, but it is the human mind which, in partnership with divine revelation, generates Torah. The human mind does not achieve this despite its limitations and deficiencies. Rather, these limitations and deficiencies are themselves integral to the process by which Torah is generated. And the Rebbe has many talks and insights and lessons and so many things that we learn from the opinion in Torah that we don't end up following practically, right? So there's so much Torah expounded on from all the dispute and the back and forth and the opinions, not just the bottom line, and the other stuff doesn't matter. Like the other stuff we still learn so much from, which is fascinating. Okay, and that is where we're going to stop for today in this entire topic. Any thoughts or questions?
So good. So good and so much to think about.
Thank you so much. Really great.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Dina.
Okay.
Wonderful
And you guys want to
class.
continue on this topic? Like I still have more material. I'm not done.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll
Yeah,
continue
keep
unpacking
going.
this.
Excellent.
Yes, definitely.
Keep up the good work. This is definitely an interesting topic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.